Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for Next Season, Re-engage Audiences and Recover Revenue. I'm Jarrell Jenkins, Local Arts Services Coordinator with Americans for the Arts. We've got a great program planned today, and I'm so excited to pass it off to our speakers. But first, some quick reminders. ArtsU is our e-learning platform offering a variety of training options to support your work in the field. You can visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org to view upcoming events. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation today. However, you can feel free to input questions anytime by using the Q&A box. There you can also upvote questions. Questions with the most upvotes will be pushed to the top of the question queue. There are automated closed captions available for today's event. You can view these by selecting the CC button at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitle. Today's PowerPoint will be made available to you following the event. At that time, it will be added to the Resources tab on the event page. And please note that this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available in about 2 business days. You can use the link for today's webinar to access that recording. And so with that, I'll now turn it over to Jennifer Sowinski, Senior Consultant and Analyst of JCA Arts Marketing.
Great, thank you, Jarrell. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on preparing for next season, re-engaging audiences and recovering revenue. And I know that everyone's exceptionally busy right now, so we really appreciate you taking an hour to spend with us, and I hope you'll gain some valuable takeaways from today's presentation. So before we jump in, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Jennifer Sowinski. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a consulting analyst with JCA Arts Marketing. I've been with JCA for just shy of 4 years, and my background is in ticketing and audience services. And with me on this webinar is my colleague, Jamie Alexander, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi there, I'm Jamie Alexander. I'm the director of JCA Arts Marketing, and I've been at JCA for about 4.5 years. I use the pronouns she, hers.
So for those of you who might not be familiar with JCA Arts Marketing, we collaborate with cultural organizations across North America to help increase revenue, boost attendance, and grow patron loyalty. We've worked with hundreds of arts and culture clients, and our approach is very data-driven. We discover what your data is saying, and then help you use your data to craft effective marketing strategies. So on to today's agenda. I know that everyone is trying to wrap their heads around planning for the upcoming season, so the goal of our webinar today is to try to help give you a framework for your planning, to hopefully make things feel a little less chaotic and to help you focus your energy and your attention. So we're going to start by introducing a framework for how to think about decision-making for the upcoming season as compared to past seasons in the past 1.5 years. Then we'll talk about setting yourself up for success for on sale and for the start of your season, which we're calling the starting formation. Next, we'll talk about how to plan for the unknowns. So that's building your playbook. And then we'll sum everything up at the end and then hopefully answer some of your questions. So if you have any questions as we're going through, as Jarrell said, please feel free to enter them into the questions box anytime and we'll answer them at the end. So before we get into the playbook, I want to talk a little bit about the place we're currently in as an industry. Something that we've found very useful throughout the pandemic is this framework for decision-making context called the Cynefin framework. This framework was developed about 20 years ago, and its purpose is to give decision makers a sense of place. The idea being that you can make better decisions if you understand the place that you're making those decisions from. So there are 4 primary domains in the Cynefin framework, and then complete disorder is at the center. So the first domain in the bottom right is the simple domain, also known as the obvious or clear domain. Here, there are best practices and standard operating procedures established. Then there's the complicated domain, where things aren't necessarily obvious, but there are good practices you can follow, and you have the opportunity to analyze the situation before you respond. Next, the complex domain is less clear, and then you have the chaotic domain, where you just have to act first and respond later. And there's actually a cartoon version of this that I think helps explain it even better. So this is the same framework, but in cartoon format. So now up in the top right, we have that clear domain, the most structured, there's best practices, plenty of expert advice, and decision-making is more about categorizing issues and responding with those best practices. Things in the clear domain are known and familiar. And then you have the complicated domain. This is where there are good practices, but you need to do some analysis in order to make good decisions. The right answer isn't necessarily obvious like it would be in the clear domain. Things in the complicated domain are knowable, but unfamiliar. So in pre-pandemic times, most of us probably oscillated up here between these two ordered domains. There were some things that kind of almost ran themselves, others required some more analysis and out-of-the-box thinking, but for the most part, we were up here. And then the pandemic came along, and just like that little cartoon orange guy falling off the cliff, we were shoved into the chaotic domain. So in the chaotic domain, there are no previous practices to follow. We're forced to act first and then respond to the consequences. So I'm sure we all remember canceling performances and then dealing with the fallout from that. This is the domain of putting out fires, like you can see in the cartoon, and it's where circumstances are just completely unknowable. And then from there, we all kind of moved over into the complex domain. And the complex is the domain of the unknown. So there's some emerging good practices. We at least have the chance to kind of probe the situation before jumping right to a decision, but we still have to kind of figure out each step along the way. And I would say that most of us have been in this complex domain for most of the last year and a half because there's been just so much that has been unknown. So what we're doing now is we're finally trying to climb out of the complex and get back to the complicated. The Delta variant is throwing us for another loop. We might be back in that complex trying to reprobe and redecide, but we're trying to get back to that complicated area where things are knowable. And there's a lot of aspects of the season that can feel pretty confident about what's happening, but the context overall is still pretty unfamiliar. So that was a long-winded introduction to the framework for this presentation, which is how do we deal with the unknown and unfamiliar parts of the upcoming season? What questions should we be asking? What do we learn from the answers to those questions? And what's the best way to respond? So basically, what we need to help with our decision-making during this complicated time is a playbook. So in sports, a playbook is used to plan in advance for the unknowns. Strategies are laid out in advance to make decision-making in the moment faster and more efficient. So in the case of a sports team, the primary unknown is what the other team is going to do. But for us, going into this first in-person post-pandemic season, our unknowns revolve around audience behavior. So in the rest of this webinar, we're going to talk about ways to look ahead and create your own playbook to set your organization for success in the upcoming season. And just to warn you, you're about to hear two people who do not play team sports lean pretty heavily on this playbook analogy. So I hope you'll join us in the spirit of the idea, even if the analogy isn't perfect. So to set up our playbook, we're going to go through setting your starting formation coming out of the pandemic, including segmentation strategy, starting prices, and forecasting. Key performance indicators. So what should you be measuring to track the effectiveness of your strategies and track your progress towards goals? And creating the plays. What strategies should you have in your back pocket to make decision-making easier in the heat of the moment? So to kick things off, I'm going to pass things over to Jamie.
Thanks, Jennifer. So to start drafting our playbook, we're first going to look at our starting formation, which includes defining our segments, setting our starting prices, and forecasting ticket sales and revenue. We're going to look at segmentation first because you could consider audience segments the players in our playbook. So let's briefly review what segmentation is and why it's important. Ultimately, segmentation is part of a bigger concept called customer relationship management, which is the practice of centering the customer in all decision-making and deepening your engagement with them. Segmentation is part of this practice as it allows you to put the patron first and talk to them about what matters to them. So why is segmentation so important for arts organizations? Well, it puts the patrons first by acknowledging who they are and what they value. The value of the art lies in the hearts and minds of customers, and everybody values art differently. So by using segmentation, you can categorize customers according to how they value the art you produce, which enables you to send the right message to the right people at the right time to inspire action. Secondly, segmentation enables you to divide up your larger goals into smaller, measurable goals so they're more attainable. By creating goals for each audience segment, you'll be able to focus your marketing efforts. Something that we often hear from clients is that segmentation sounds overwhelming. And how do you have enough staff and resources to put segmentation into action? Because people think that they'll have to build 5 separate marketing campaigns for 5 separate segments. But actually, segmentation should make your marketing efforts more efficient and effective. Because if you know the actions that you need people in each segment to take in order to reach your goal, then focusing on incentivizing those actions will cut out the extra noise and energy spent on efforts that aren't going to help you reach your goal. So here's a simple example of how segmentation can make your goals more achievable by dividing them up into smaller goals. Say that our goal is to grow our audiences by 10% this season. So that's a large and lofty goal. How are we going to get there? Well, we'll reach this goal by achieving these smaller segment goals. So now all of our marketing initiatives can focus on reaching these segment goals, which, if met, will allow us to meet our larger goal. So this can be part of your playbook for reopening, setting your season goal, breaking down your season goal into smaller segment goals, and leveraging the segmentation to focus your marketing planning. And a related side note, if you haven't read Measure What Matters by John Doerr, I highly recommend checking it out. The book explores the concept of OKRs, or objectives and key results, which is a goal-setting tool used by teams and individuals to set challenging and ambitious goals with measurable results. We started using OKRs at JCA and have found it really helpful in focusing our efforts, so we recommend it to you as well as you work on setting your goals. So let's talk about the segmentations that you'll need now as you look toward restarting in-person performances after COVID. Your audience segmentation before COVID might have looked like this. This is a basic segmentation that we reference frequently with clients. This basic segmentation categorizes customers according to their frequency and shows key metrics related to each segment. So you could be using a segmentation like this, or maybe you're using one like this, which is a bit more complex. This is from the Royal Shakespeare Company, which also uses geographic location and other metrics to categorize its patrons. Or you could be using a segmentation like this from SF Jazz, which categorizes segments based on their repertoire preferences and can be cross-tabbed with the basic segmentation. These are all fantastically useful segmentations, but just as COVID makes everything more complicated, you'll now have to layer in another segmentation, which might look like this. A segmentation like this will be essential to reboot your relationship with patrons according to their level of interaction with you during COVID and beyond. And actually, this is a simple COVID segmentation. A more representative COVID segmentation might look like this, where we're breaking up our pre-COVID attenders by their engagement with us during COVID. So what we need to do is to look at each individual segment and determine what actions we want to see from each segment to help us reach our larger goals for reopening. As we think about setting segment goals, let's look at a framework that we use frequently when setting segment growth goals. And that's that there are really only 5 ways to increase sales volume, or the number of tickets sold. And those are that you can acquire new customers, you can reactivate lapsed customers, get them to come back, you can retain last year's customers, you can get customers to buy more shows, increase frequency, you can get people to bring more people with them, so increase the party size. And I actually argue there's a 6th way to increase sales volume now, which is by getting your digital customers to attend in person. So let's build our playbook pages for each of these segments. We'll start with pre-COVID loyalists. Who are pre-COVID loyalists? Well, they're subscribers, recent multi-buyers, or less frequent buyers who have been attending for a long time. I think you've all probably been talking a lot lately about subscribers, since many of you have already announced your seasons and started your subscription campaigns, or you will soon. But it's important to remember that some of your most loyal audiences and biggest fans may not be subscribers. They may be long-time single ticket buyers or recent multi-buyers, so those are important segments to remember. And I want to emphasize that this is really a really important segment for reopening. A lot of the primary research we've done during COVID has shown us that those who were frequent attendees of an organization before COVID are more likely to return upon reopening than those who haven't attended before. And this is likely due to the trust and the familiarity that your segment has with the organization. So your marketing efforts to target this segment may yield higher returns than other segments. A good goal for this segment would be to determine an ideal rate at which you want to reactivate these buyers. And you probably want to include a frequency metric in the goal as well. Here we've listed reactivating at the same frequency as pre-COVID in our goal, but maybe you adjust the frequency goal if you're doing fewer or more performances than you did before COVID. And then going back to the playbook metaphor, we want to set our starting formation, or our plans out of the gate to re-engage these patrons, sorry. Here are a few ways to engage them. First, we want to assure people that they will be safe when they return to your venue. And this is paramount for getting people to return, of course, because of the Delta variant. So if you haven't already done your own research on your audience's safety preferences, what will encourage them to come back, make them safe to come back, we recommend you look at Colleen Dillenschneider's Know Your Own Bone blog or Wolf Brown's Audience Outlook Monitor to see what audiences around the country are saying about what will make them feel safe in a venue. Next, you can take a book out of the behavioral economics playbook and use social influence nudges to motivate people to return to the theater. This is where you make reference to what others are doing in order to influence similar behavior. So you could say in marketing materials, for example, something to the effect of, we've been playing to full houses, come join the fun, or join the hundreds of people who have already bought tickets to come back to the magic of live theater. And finally, you can offer targeted discounts to members of the segment who are price sensitive and have used discounts to attend in the past to motivate return. And then we have the pre-COVID newbies. These are people who either subscribed or bought a single ticket from you for the first time in 2019-20. This is a really precious segment because they took a leap of faith with you and attended their first performance right before the shutdown. And you might have been the last organization, the last performance they saw before the shutdown. So a likely goal is to retain a certain percentage of this segment in 21-22. And to figure out what that percentage should be, you can look back at pre-COVID retention rates of first-time buyers and decide how aggressive you want your goal to be. Just a note, you may be wondering why we're not giving you the actual percentages for each of these goals. We have those X's there. It's because that's not really how we do things at JCA Arts Marketing. Everybody's audience behaves differently. So while there are trends of first-time retention rates, for example, we don't want to assume or suggest that your audience behaves the same way. So we're imploring you to do the dive into your own data. Looking at our starting formation for this segment, here are a few ideas to incentivize return. You can send a personalized invitation to be part of your community, again, by using social influence nudges. You can also tap into nostalgia by pointing out that this maybe have been the last show they saw before the shutdown and ask them to celebrate the return of the performing arts with you. Or again, for those who use discounts to attend for the first time, you can use a discount to incentivize return. Next, let's look at new COVID audiences. So these are people who did not purchase tickets to your organization before COVID, but started engaging with you, with your organization through digital performances or other programming during the shutdown. We did a study with 10 organizations that looked at the behavior of digital audiences and found that 32% of bookers of digital tickets had never purchased tickets before. So this is a big and important segment. And if you can get these folks to keep engaging, it will be a silver lining to come out of the shutdown. So our goals for this segment could be to split into a goal for local digital audiences and a goal for non-local audiences. For local audiences, you'll want to identify the percentage of the segment that you want to convert into in-person attendees. And for non-local audiences, you want to retain a certain percentage through further digital programming. So your starting formation for this segment could be, again, an invitation to attend in person, recognizing and thanking their engagement with digital programming. And you could also focus your messaging on safety assurances, because remember, this audience has never been in through your doors before. So not only are you tackling the COVID protocol safety, but just getting them to feel comfortable in general in your house. And finally, you can offer a discount for first-time in-person attendance. And finally, we come to the post-COVID adventurers. This is an acquisition segment of people who will attend for the first time after COVID. Sorry, so it should be post-opening adventurers. Through research we've done with our clients during COVID, we've found evidence to suggest that among people who have not attended an organization before, younger people have more interest in attending upon reopening. So this may be because younger folks see themselves at less risk of contracting the virus and are also eager to get out and about. And so this could be an opportunity to grow your younger audience. So your goal should be to acquire a specific number of new audience members and then get a certain percentage of audience members to return again. Some tactics to attract the segment might include messaging about safety, of course, discounts for first-time attendance, and a welcome note or phone call for following the performance. So you're probably wondering, how do I find these segments within my database? If you're on Testatora, it's fairly easy to identify these segments. If you're using the segmentation engine, you can use our performance classification tool, circled here, to classify performances as pre, during, or post-COVID, to identify people in each segment according to which performances they attended. And we also have a COVID recovery segmentation, which we can install for segmentation engine users. For those of you who are on Spectrix, Spectrix has some really great segmentation tools that you can put to use here. You can define your segments using the time of performance, whether it was pre, during, or post-COVID, and frequency of attendance, and then use those segments in reporting as well as for messaging and targeted emails. Once your segments are defined in Spectrix, you can compare reports filtered by different segments so that you can see which measures vary most significantly by segment and get baseline measures, as Jennifer will talk about shortly. Okay, great. So we've set the starting formation for our segments, or the players in our playbook. Let's move on to creating the starting formation for revenue management. This is the standard definition of revenue management coined by Robert Cross in his popular book, which says that revenue management ensures that companies will sell the right product to the right customer at the right time for the right price. He also goes on to say that revenue management is the art and science of predicting real-time customer demand and optimizing the price and availability of products. Oh, sorry, 1 second. So demand in the arts. So that's our task with revenue management, is to predict demand and then react accordingly. And this is tricky right now for a lot of reasons. First, because demand in the arts is entirely driven by our audience's willingness to pay for a ticket. And that willingness to pay is based on the perceived value that an individual thinks they're going to get from the purchase. And of course, that perceived value is going to be different for every patron. But we know this. This is true whether there's a pandemic or not. That's why we differentiate our prices so that we can offer the right price to as many customers as possible. If you've ever heard us speak about pricing before, you know how strongly we feel about differentiated pricing. But the reason we're here today is to talk about planning for the unknowns in the upcoming season. And that unknown is, how has the pandemic changed our audience's perception of value? And in turn, how much has their willingness to pay changed? So obviously, one of the first steps in preparing for your upcoming season is to set single ticket prices. We can think of this as our starting revenue management formation. So when you set your prices, you need to first look at economic trends to see where prices are trending and how people are spending their money. This is a glance at the US Consumer Price Index, which shows an upward trend in prices for all items. And you also need to look at industry trends. Here's an example of a graph from the Chicago cohort of Wolf Brown's Audience Outlook Monitor that shows that more than 87% of audiences are willing to spend as much or more when they return to the performing arts. These charts show us that the good news that the majority of audiences are reporting that when they're able to return to live events, they plan to spend as much or more on tickets than they did before the pandemic. And in our own survey-based research that we've done for recent JCA clients, I can say quite confidently that we haven't seen any major evidence of increased price sensitivity since before the pandemic. So when you're determining that starting price formation, there's no pandemic-based reason to lower price right out of the gates. There may be other reasons to adjust your prices, like for equity and inclusion, but there aren't reasons based on price sensitivity research. So once you've set your prices, you want to create a forecast, however you typically create your forecasts, whether by performance, production, or season, using historical data. This will be important to use as a baseline for your playbook, as Jennifer will tell us more about soon. So that concludes our starting formation. And here's a checklist to reiterate what to do to set your starting formation for your playbook. So first, you want to update your standard audience segmentation. Then you want to identify your COVID segments. You want to set your segment goals, plan your engagement tactics or your starting formation for each segment, set your starting prices, and finally create your sales forecasts. So I'm going to hand it back to Jennifer to start building your playbook plays.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. So you've got your starting formation all set, and the next step is to create a plan for how you'll react to the unknowns in the upcoming season. We don't know exactly how our audience is going to behave compared to previous seasons, and just like any year, we don't know exactly how well each performance is going to sell. So those are some of the unknowns that we want to plan for and create strategies to be successful, whatever is thrown at us. So we need to make a plan. And our first step in creating a plan is to identify what measures you're going to track. What are the key performance indicators that are going to help you determine whether you're meeting your goals or whether a change in strategy is necessary? Tracking KPIs should always be a key part of your marketing plan, but it's especially important right now with all of the uncertainty in demand, especially with what we're facing thanks to the Delta variant. So once you've determined your KPIs, you'll then need to identify what are the checkpoints or triggers that would make you shift your strategy or employ a new tactic. And then you'll want to plan for what those shifts in strategy would look like. So in our playbook analogy, those would be the plays. So the first step is choosing your key performance indicators. When choosing KPIs, you want to make sure, first of all, that they're measurable and trackable. An indicator isn't going to do any good if you can't track it. And also make sure that it's actionable. You don't want to spend a lot of time and effort tracking something on a regular basis if it's not ultimately going to impact your strategy and your decision making. So the right KPIs for your particular organization might be different, but there are some measures that we think are going to be particularly important in the coming year in order to recognize opportunities for strategy shifts. Some measures are going to be best tracked on a performance level, either by individual performance, production, or price band. And these measures are speed of sale, capacity sold, and average yield by ticket, along with cost of discount. And then there are other measures that you want to track against particular segments of your audience, as Jamie talked about earlier. And these measures include things like average yield, rates of retention, conversion, or reactivation, depending on the segment, the number of new bookers, and average frequency. So I'm going to take a closer look at several of these and talk about how to plan out your strategies or your potential plays based on these different KPIs. But before we get into strategies, your carefully chosen KPIs won't do you any good if you're not tracking and checking them regularly. So make sure to make a plan for when and how often you're going to check them and take action. So some measures like speed of sales, you might track very regularly, maybe weekly or even daily. Some might be better to track at the end of each production or after a full weekend of concerts, but others might not have built-in or obvious timeframes. The segmentation KPIs are based on segment behavior, not necessarily based on a specific performance. So you might check those at set points relative to when performances go on sale. Or if your organization has long production runs, maybe you set certain points during the production to check your KPIs, something like a month before the first performance, a week before, 1 week into the run, and then at the end of the run. The exact timeframes are going to be different depending on your unique organization, but make sure you've identified exactly when you plan to check your progress. Make sure that it's frequent enough that you have time to identify when something isn't working and change it, but not so frequent that you're tempted to abandon a strategy before it's had the chance to prove in whether it works. So I know that when we cram a whole bunch of suggestions into a single webinar, it can feel a little overwhelming. So what I want to make sure is clear here is that you don't want to be trying to check every single measure every single day. That's not sustainable, it's not efficient, and it's not going to be the best use of your time. So instead, set aside time regularly based on how often you actually intend to act on your KPIs, which might be daily or weekly for some of them, but for others, longer periods of time are going to make more sense. So let's dig into a few of these specific measures now to review how you can plan ahead and make decision making easier for yourself down the road. I'm going to start with speed of sale. And this is a measure that you're probably going to keep a pretty close eye on. You might check it almost every day and plan to act on it weekly. And I'm starting with speed of sale because it's a measure that's very likely to be significantly different from before the pandemic. We've seen data from places where live performances have been happening for several months, that there's a significant shift to last minute ticket sales. Audiences are worried about buying tickets too far in advance and having shows canceled again, so they're waiting to spend their money. So it's going to be important to track your speed of sales closely and pay attention to how it looks compared to your forecast and how it's different from past seasons. Keep in mind that there are a lot of different shapes that a sales curve can take to get you to the same goal. And it's likely that your sales curves in the upcoming season might look different from the ones in the past. So you might be used to this S-shaped sales curve, or even something that looks like this if you have a lot of subscribers that buy up front. But be prepared that this season, you might end up with curves that look more like this. So plan in advance for that so that you won't be tempted to panic discount every ticket in sight. And once you have a few post-pandemic performances under your belt, you may want to use them to reforecast performances later in the season, especially if the sales curves do look significantly different from the past. So since sales curves might look different from our forecast, especially at the beginning of this season, it's going to be extra important to focus in on a more micro level of speed of sales to help you make pricing decisions. So for example, here is a chart showing sales for a single performance by price zone and seating area. So each bar represents a different price zone, and you can see that I've split it here by orchestra and balcony. And the colors indicate how long before a performance a ticket is sold, starting with 12 weeks before the performance in dark blue, and then going up through the weeks to 8 weeks out where we currently are in the light green color. So it's obvious here that Section B is selling faster than Section A. Section A and Section B started out at a similar price through that dark blue, purple, and blue, but in the last 2 weeks, Section A has slowed down while Section B has continued selling. So what's our play here? From this chart alone, there could be a few potential plays, but we need to look at other measures to determine the right one. So some of our potential plays could be, we might lower the price on Section A. And this might be the right call if overall sales for the performance are very slow compared to other performances around it, which we'll talk about in just a minute, or if it's more important to fill up the front of the house than it is to maximize revenue. But I will say that more often than not, this is not the play I'm going to actually choose. So our next option might be to increase the price on Section B. And I like this option a lot better. It might be the right choice if overall sales for the performance are doing fairly well. And the benefit of this option is that you're making more revenue for each ticket purchased in Section B, and you're more likely to nudge people into Section A, where you'll make even more revenue. Our third option, play 3, might be to send targeted discount offers to specific segments of our audience that we've identified would be the most motivated by a discount. And we'll talk more about targeted discounts by segment in a little bit, but the benefit of this play is that it comes with communication attached. You're helping people feel like they're getting more value for less money. And you're not lowering prices across the board, so your value proposition and your potential revenue from other ticket buyers stay intact. It's also possible that you might want to combine plays 2 and 3 to increase revenue from those interested in Section B tickets, while also incentivizing target audiences to purchase Section A. So as I said, you'll want to consult with some other measures to help decide which play is the right one to use, but knowing kind of what your options are going to help make the decision process easier. The next measure I'm going to focus on is capacity sold. So this is kind of zooming back out from an individual performance to look at trends over a longer time frame. Here we're looking at the capacity sold for an entire series of performances that take place across the upcoming season. Many of you are probably already looking at something like this on a regular basis, but you probably want to plan to take action on this KPI maybe approximately weekly. So when we're looking at capacity sold, we want to see which upcoming performances are ahead of those around them and which are behind. In some ways, this is actually going to be more useful for spotting demand than the sales curve is, because the sales curve is used to compare upcoming performances to past performances, which is kind of like apples and oranges this year. But when we look at sales across the whole upcoming season, we see that we know that the same changes in audience behavior are affecting all of these performances, so we can spot the relative demand. And then just like speed of sale, you'll want to plan out some strategies and levers that you can pull depending on how each performance is selling. So if a performance is particularly high capacity sold, you might look closer at that performance for dynamic pricing opportunities to maximize revenue. And if there are multiple performances of the same title, make sure that your pricing matches the relative demand for each performance. We might also consider the discounts and offers that we have out there and pull back on discounts from the most popular performances. And then also consider how you can leverage popular performances to help sales on the less in-demand performances. This can also play into some of the segment strategies we'll talk about in a bit, but I think about whether you could do a package deal or a discount on another less popular show with the purchase of this popular show. And I know that I'm being really vague because I'm talking about this set of hypothetical performances, but when you're working on your playbook, I think it's important to include all of your possible strategies, even if the details don't come into focus until it's time to actually implement one of these plays. And then on the flip side, for performances with a relatively low capacity sold, you might do the opposite, like focus targeted discounting efforts on those low performing shows. Check sales by price zone to see whether it's a pricing issue or simply just low demand across the board. And then calling back to that last slide, are there popular performances that you can leverage to help sales on this show? For example, consider targeted messaging or offers to those who have already purchased something for the upcoming season, because we know that those people have shown that they're willing to attend in-person performances again, which is probably one of the biggest barriers we're facing in the coming year. So now shifting gears a little bit, the measures that I just went through were all about monitoring performances, but there are also some measures you're going to want to monitor by audience segment. So Jamie did a great job of talking us through our suggested post-COVID segments earlier. So I want to talk a little bit more about creating your playbook for those segments. So you're probably not going to monitor these KPIs on quite as regular of a basis as you do your performance and your pricing measures. You might check these monthly or after each production or at significant points during your season, like before and after a holiday show. It really depends on how your season is structured, but it's important to define in advance what those checkpoints are. So when we think of KPIs by segment, it's really helpful to consider how they work together to inform your decision making. So we're going to shift now into looking at groups of measures by segment. And the most important measures for your organization might be different, but the ones that we think are really key are retention, conversion, or reactivation rate, depending on the segment, the total number of bookers, the average yield, that's the average amount paid per ticket, average frequency, or how many times someone has attended per year, discount drift, which is the difference between the average paid per ticket and the full price of the ticket. So this measure tells us how much of a discount on average someone is getting. And then time of booking. How far out before the performance date is someone booking a ticket? So when you're in the step of identifying your KPIs and the other measures you'll use to create your strategies, it's also really important to understand what your baselines for these measures are, because they'll be less meaningful if you're just looking at numbers in a vacuum. So make sure to take note of what typical numbers for each measure are, for each measure in each segment. So that way, when you get into the season, you'll have something to compare it to. So I'm not going to look at every segment that Jamie outlined for us, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. So first, we have the pre-COVID loyalists. And as a reminder, these are people who were loyal attenders to your organization before COVID, either as subscribers or frequent single ticket buyers. And we should be checking in on the KPI for this segment on a regular basis, but just to show you an example of what this might look like, let's pretend we're planning for the midpoint of our season. So the goal for this particular segment is to reactivate or bring back 50% of the segment over the course of the season. Now, for some of you, 50% may be really low. For others, it might be too high. You need to set the goal according to your own organization, but we're setting 50% as the goal for my imaginary organization. So I have a baseline for this segment based on what they did in 2018-19, which is my most recent complete season. I know how many total bookers I'm looking at. I know they typically spend $57 per ticket, the number of times they typically attend, and how much of a discount they get. So now when I'm doing my planning, there are basically 3 scenarios to plan for. Am I going to be ahead of goal, on track to my goal, or behind my goal? So I might be ahead of goal. In this scenario, my pace is looking good to reactivate 50% of the segment. The average yield is lower than my baseline though, so I might want to plan out what my possible plays are. So my plays in this case might be to look into reducing discounting to increase that average yield and get it back up to where it was before. Or I might look into adjusting the timing of my marketing because I notice that this group is booking much closer to the performance that they did before. So I might adjust things to see if I can get them back out booking earlier. And I might also try to focus efforts on encouraging those who have already attended to return again to bump up that frequency number. All of these are possible plays that I might make if I'm ahead of my goal on getting the pre-COVID loyalists back. Or the next scenario could be that I'm right on track to meet my reactivation goal. So in this case, I might just stick with my original plan for re-engaging the segment and focus on other segments that might need more attention in order to reach their goals. So in this case, my play might just be to simply stay the course and focus on other segments. And then the third scenario might be that I'm trending behind my goal. So in this example, I'm getting a lower average yield than my baseline. And I want to think about what my play might be in this scenario. So it might be testing out some discounts. This is typically my highest paying segment and they're paying less than usual. So it could be that there's more price sensitivity in this group than there was before, and discounts might be a good incentive. And it's also worth noting that if this were the case, if my segment that typically pays the most has a low average yield, it might be a sign that in fact my audience in general is a little price sensitive. So if I saw this in the real world, I would want to go back and look at some of the pricing measures we just talked about to see if I need to adjust my overall pricing. But another play might be adding incentives to increase frequency. Those who are coming back from this segment are not coming back with their usual frequency, and they're already paying less than usual per ticket. So maybe there's some non-discount incentives I can give to increase frequency. Things like parking passes, drink tickets, or encouraging the segment to come back multiple times with incentives for the purchase of multiple performances. And then another thing to consider is how to address the reason this group might not be coming back. If I'm behind my goals, maybe it's time to review my messaging, especially around health and safety, to make these loyal customers feel as comfortable as possible with coming back. The other segment that I want to spend a little bit of time with is the new COVID audience segment. So this is the segment of folks who purchased tickets during the pandemic, whether to digital, outdoor, socially distanced performances, whatever your organization has been doing during closure. And our goal for this segment in my imaginary organization is to convert 30% of them into in-person attenders. So this could definitely be a challenging group to engage. So we're expecting a smaller percentage of the segment to attend than we did from the loyalists. And we have some baseline numbers based on what these bookers did during COVID, which we kind of can expect may not really be indicative of what they'll do after, but we've recorded them still, so we have something to compare to. So again, we have a potential scenario where we're tracking ahead of our goal. And really all of the measures we're tracking look pretty good in this scenario. So our possible plays here might be to reduce discounts. This segment is actually paying less than they were during the pandemic, and it definitely made sense to give them discounts to encourage them to change their behavior and attend in person. But now that I see they're doing that, maybe it's time to pull back on those. Or we might consider putting some additional goals on the segment. It's a new segment, so setting goals ahead of time is going to be tricky, but midway through the season might be the right time to set an extra goal, like increasing the average frequency per booker. And then, of course, we might just want to focus on other segments that aren't on track to meet their goals and spend more of our attention on those other segments. And again, another scenario might be that we're right on track, in which case we might not change the plan, or again, we might focus on an additional goal, like adjusting our marketing timing to get them to book farther out before their performance. And then finally, we might find ourselves behind goal, in which case our strategies might include sending discounts and other incentives to increase their conversion rate from new COVID booker to traditional in-person booker. You might review the timing of your marketing to make sure that it's reaching bookers at the time they're ready to buy. And you might consider the other barriers that this group specifically faces. They might live too far away, which is a barrier we can't overcome, but they also might just be nervous about attending in person if they never have. And it might be that they're nervous about COVID, which you can hopefully address with your safety messaging, but they also might be nervous about the more traditional things like what to wear and how to behave and how to act at an in-person performance. So make sure that you're messaging to those people accordingly. So I realize that thinking about all of these scenarios for all of these segments can feel like a lot, but remember that you're doing the work in advance to make your decision-making down the road much easier. When it comes to actually time to check and react to your KPIs, you're not going to have all of these scenarios. You're going to have one scenario for each segment. So it might look something more like this. In the real world, you're not just going to have a baseline to compare your segments to, but you're also going to be able to compare across segments. And likely you're going to have some segments that are reaching or exceeding their goals and others that are not. So the idea behind all of this segmentation work and planning is not to increase your workload by giving you all of these different things to worry about. It's to help you focus your efforts on where you can be most effective and have the biggest impact. So to sum up the process of building your playbook, you first need to establish your KPIs so that you know what you're tracking and what you're aiming for. Next, you want to establish checkpoints so that you know when you plan to review and act on the KPIs you've identified. Also, make sure to record a baseline for the measures that you're tracking so that you do have something to compare back to. And then plan out your pricing plays by production, performance, and price band, and plan out your segmentation plays by segment so that you have strategies and tactics ready when needed. So with that, I'm going to pass things back to Jamie for a recap.
Great. So at this point, we've finished building our playbook. So to wrap up, we thought we'd show you some real life examples of playbooks at organizations. Here's a really simple playbook, which gives 3 sales curve scenarios, and the icons represent tactics to take along the way in each sales curve, such as when you increase prices or add discounts. This next slide is a more complex playbook, which gives tactics according to what capacity the show is at each week before the performances. This includes when to release holds, when to offer seat upgrades, when to give offers to groups, etc. So to recap, we talked about how we're in the complex domain where we're making plans for an unknown future. And then we set our starting formation where we set our segmentation strategy, our starting prices, and our forecast. And then we built the playbook by identifying KPIs, establishing checkpoints, and crafting plays. So just a reminder, this is a lot to digest, and we just wanted to remind you that if you need support in preparing for a successful opening season, we're here for you. At JCA, we offer segmentation consulting to help you define segments unique to your audience and set goals and tactics for each segment. And we also offer pricing consulting to help you uncover demand and create pricing strategies to maximize revenue without sacrificing accessibility and inclusion. If you're short-staffed going into reopening, we can also provide marketing support and support with your systems and data. All right, so that concludes our presentation. I'm sure you might have some questions for us to answer. So I think we have some time to answer. And we also have our contact information on the screen here in case you want to reach out to either Jennifer and I one-on-one.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jamie and Jennifer, for that super informative presentation. Incredibly insightful. And I know folks will get the most out of this presentation. So let's kind of jump into Q&A. If you have a question, you can still pop it in the Q&A box. If you had questions coming in here and you still have them, this is your invite to please place them in the Q&A box, because we want to make sure that this resource is for you and that we're here to answer your questions. This first one, Jamie and Jennifer, is 2 parts. So we'll break down part 1. So part 1 of the question is, if a show is not selling well, how do you keep single ticket prices high enough so subscribers still feel they are getting the best price while making prices attractive enough to singles to encourage sales? How to plan for this kind of situation in advance while using the playbook?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when it comes to thinking about single ticket prices, there's very few scenarios where we recommend lowering your single ticket prices from where they started. The lowering single ticket prices is typically the thing to do only when you see those lowest prices selling while the top prices are not. If that's the case, you know you might have a mismatch with the value your patrons are placing on the performance because they're buying the cheapest tickets. If that's not what you're seeing and you're just seeing low sales kind of across the board, that's an indicator that it's probably not just a pricing issue. And in that case, discounts are going to be a much better incentive than lowering the actual price. Because for one, it comes with communication. If you're giving someone a discount, you're sending them some kind of communication to say they're getting the discount. It also makes them feel like they're getting more for less, which is a really good motivator to actually buy because they feel like they're getting a deal. And that helps you not anger your subscribers by not having a publicly lower price than they might be paying, because they don't know that Joe Schmo got a discount that maybe you're only offering to people who attended a digital performance and not to anyone else. So that's where segmentation is really key. And so to answer your question about putting that into the playbook, identifying in advance which segments will really be motivated by a discount, looking for those folks who have only bought with the discount before, who tend to buy the cheapest seats, knowing who those people are in advance is really going to help with your planning so that when you do have a show where you need to send discounts, you already know who you're going to send them to.
Awesome, great. And then part 2 of that question, what perks can subscribers still get post-pandemic that don't apply to single ticket buyers? Any new perks that either of you have come across?
I don't know if I've come across many new perks, with the exception of flexibility is more important than ever. So it's just making sure that people, I mean, if you have the ability to do absolute free exchanges or refunds for subscribers, that's an option. Although I kind of would argue that at this point with the Delta variant, it's probably worth having refunds and exchanges available for all ticket buyers. Other new benefits you can think of, Jennifer?
I think choice of seat may become more important too, as people are wanting to be spaced out. So allowing subscribers to move their seats around, even kind of at the last minute, picking a seat that might not be near people, like that could be something that we normally wouldn't encourage, but maybe subscribers could get to do something like that. That's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. I think it's a really great question. Yeah.
No, those are
a good thing to think about.
Yeah, no, those were great responses. And I hope, Robin, that question was answered for you. If you have any additional questions or follow-up questions with that, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. I'll send another invite for questions, but if there aren't any, I'll go ahead with mine. So my first question was around the part of your presentation where you mentioned the 5 ways to increase sales volume. I was wondering if you could share maybe the top 2 to 3 ways for maybe a small team that maybe can't find the capacity to achieve all. What would the top 2 to 3 be for them to focus on?
Yeah, so I think that retention, and I'm trying to think back to the actual to the slide. I think that retention and acquisition is where I would focus. So retention meaning that you're trying to get the people who came last season to come back, and even people who came within this season to come back. Because I think that, those folks are probably the best prospects in your database. You're going to get the best response from them, assuming that they had a good experience. So you have to make sure they have good experiences. I think that's really important. And then I think the other segment is acquisition, because primarily because it's an expensive segment to engage, but I think that's because of people's DEI efforts. You need to make sure that you're engaging a more diverse and broad audience within your community.
Yeah, I think frequency is going to be really key for this season, because once you know someone is willing to come back in person to your venue, you got to try to get them back again. They're going to be the easiest to kind of retarget and just really focus on increasing frequency, especially this year, I think more than ever.
Get them comfortable with it, get them coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My next question was around Jennifer, I think in your part of the presentation, you had mentioned knowing the difference between if it's a pricing issue or something else. So I was just wondering, for folks who are maybe new to their roles or new to their organization, what are some key indicators of a show that's maybe performing not so well when it comes to pricing issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the 2 key things to pay attention to are how it's doing compared to other performances around it, to know whether it's just simply demand or, across the board, that just everything's kind of selling slow and it's not that performance, it's just everything, or whether it's really doing significantly net less sales than the things around it. So I think that's really critical because, as I said in the presentation, something like a sales curve compared to last year isn't going to do it for you. We just kind of don't know what those are going to look like. And then within that performance, to know whether it's a pricing issue, it's important to compare across price sections how the performance is doing. So if the top price, the medium price, and the low price, like if you have three and they're all selling about the same, they're all kind of just not selling very fast, it's probably not a pricing issue. Whereas if that lowest price is selling and nothing else is, that's an indicator that maybe you actually do have the prices too high and you need to adjust. And if you don't have multiple prices in a single performance, we think you should, but that's another conversation. If you don't, if you only have one, then compare across performances. If the lowest price performance is selling, same thing. So just anything you have to compare is going to be helpful.
Great, thank you. And do you think people can use the same metric if it's virtual programming?
Yeah, I think so. It's a little trickier with multiple prices then. I think it's great to still offer multiple prices, but people choose different prices for different reasons in a virtual performance. It's usually more about how they feel about giving to the organization and the value of the performance rather than the seat. But other than that, yes, I think the same metrics apply.
Great, thanks. I have two more questions. One, you mentioned discount drift throughout the presentation. I was wondering if you can just define that for folks.
Yes, discount drift is the difference between the full price of a ticket and the average amount someone pays for that ticket. So it's a measure of how much of a discount either a person is getting for when they buy tickets, or for a performance overall, how much of a discount are people purchasing getting?
Great. And is there a more attractive discount than others that you would say for folks to implement?
We have this debate quite often.
I am so curious.
So Jennifer prefers, I'll just speak for Jennifer, sorry. She prefers dollars off, because when you do percentages off, people don't usually like to do the math. Like, what is 30% off of a ticket? Like, that's, I've also seen some, it's really unique to each individual company though. I've also seen some companies where they only do buy one, get one free, because that usually yields the most ticket sales and revenue, because it's just that attractive. But it really depends on your organization, what your audience is used to.
I'm with you, Jennifer. Who's doing the math? Not me.
Yeah.
So my last question, and thank you so much, both of you, for being troopers throughout this Q&A portion. Let's see. Oh, there's a question in the Q&A box, so I won't say my question. Do you see prime and non-prime price scales this season, or one scale for the week? In other words, are Saturdays still generally more popular than Tuesdays and merit higher prices?
Yes, I will say that. Yeah. Yes. So I guess prom and non-prime, I guess a better, what we usually use for that is price differentiation by day of week and time of day. And so we always recommend differentiating your prices so you have the right prices available for a variety of different people within the audience. And yes, we still see consistently that Saturday night has higher demand than, or even in our primary research when we're looking at how audiences might perform after reopening, that there is more demand for Saturday nights and less demand for like a Tuesday night. So yeah, we still recommend for most organizations that they differentiate by weekends and weekdays, and even in more ways than that also.
Great. Well, that completes our time for today. So I really appreciate you, Jamie, and you, Jennifer, for your time, and also all of you for attending today's webinar. A reminder that this event was recorded and will be available in about 2 business days. In the meantime, you can visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org for other training opportunities and resources. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.